Bob, thanks very much indeed. And a real pleasure to see all of you here, but in particular, David, Lord Alton. And I was just mentioning off camera how, in essence, important David has been to the Leaders Club, because tonight is, I'm a bit boring with this, it's our 245th event since we started, whilst the club was started in the idea in 2008. The first event was in February 2010. And who should have presided that event but Lord Alton, and who was there and very much involved with that side then, of course, is Professor Michael Brown. And I see him and Andrea there, and it's absolutely lovely. So there from the start. And in many ways, it is, as I think of it with David, the principles, integrity and ethics of the man, the pie chart of the man, that have made me try to take the club further forward. I can remember being so taken with the Roscoe series of lectures that David instigated with Michael Brown. Michael was, of course, the Vice Chancellor, Liverpool John Moores University, where we started all this. And I'm sure perhaps David will mention a bit more about that side of the Roscoe lectures and how important it is to have brilliant speakers communicating with an audience on subjects which are of interest and relevance. Hence, you see part of this as well. Now, I've sent out a couple of bits of information about David. His experience is considerable. You may be interested, though he comes perhaps from a Lib Dem background, he's a crossbencher, and his peerage was in fact promoted by John Major. And that's why, in fact, he truly is, in many senses, a crossbencher. You can follow David on Twitter, and he blogs quite a lot. But he's a man I've indicated, of huge principle. And I think in this time when we've seen some catastrophic politics recently, how appropriate that he should be addressing us tonight on good leaders look for solutions, not slogans. Enough from me. Over to Lord David Alton. David, over to you, please.
Well, Stephen, thank you very much indeed for that very warm introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be with you, but not least because it gives me a chance to thank you for the sustained way in which you've shaped such an interesting series of talks by such a diverse and notable collection of people. So it's a great pleasure, as I say, to join them tonight. I'm going to base my remarks on what I've observed over these past 5 decades in Parliament or in local government, or through the work that I was able to do with Liverpool John Moores and in the Roscoe lecture series as well. All the kinds of people that I've been privileged to encounter. Amongst those lecturers, we had everyone from, as Michael Brown will remember, the Dalai Lama through to now King Charles, but many other people from many diverse backgrounds, not unlike what you tried to do. But this was a series of town and gown lectures to bring university and town together, and it was a chance to observe people who have made significant contributions in their own realms. Now, showing a great sense of prescience and topicality, Steve, you couldn't have chosen a better time, really, could you? In the aftermath of the funeral of her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, but also the leadership elections and the upheavals in our government, this is a very interesting moment to cast our collective eyes over what it is that we're looking for in those who lead our nation and our communities and our enterprises. The title of the talk, Good Leaders Look for Solutions, Not Slogans, is one I was quite interested to have to think about. And I started by wondering, puzzling about what are the ingredients which go into the making of a good leader. Well, I would insist at the outset that whether in the civic realm, in corporations, in business or institutions, knowing that you're accountable to something bigger than yourself is essential, and it transforms the way in which a person leads. A good leader won't only have a sense of accountability, they'll know that narcissism and egotistical conceit are shallow substitutes for integrity or tenacity, patience, perseverance, and sometimes courage. They'll value everyone who's part of their common enterprise, and in so doing, encourage inclusivity and build valued relationships. They'll build loyalty, and they'll make mistakes, of course, and learn from them. They'll know that they're fallible and plan for the day when the baton needs to pass on. And they'll cultivate what, for the purpose of this talk, I'll call servant leadership. It sounds a bit pious, but I'll try and unpack what it means. I can't imagine a better example of servant leadership, devoid of sloganeering and wholly focused throughout her long life and her calling than that of Queen Elizabeth. In 1947, the young Princess Elizabeth celebrated her 21st birthday, and on a tour of South Africa, she made a speech which would give definition to the 70 years that would follow as monarch, setting out her belief then that she was called to service. In 2007, there were echoes of that speech during the Roscoe Lecture, which Prince Charles, now King Charles III, delivered in Liverpool on the subject of good citizenship. His reference in his lecture to T.S. Eliot's Cycles of Heaven seems particularly apposite. His mother's promise to live within the cycles 6 decades earlier, she would dedicate, in her words, her whole life to your service, the service of her nation, is, I think, a wonderful example of the cycles of heaven. It became her lodestar, guiding her unstinting belief in the centrality of public service to the principle of duty, and it shaped her self-evident goodness. In his first warm and I think well-received message to the nation, King Charles reiterated those same words, understanding that his mother has redefined how, in a parliamentary democracy, a constitutional monarch's leadership must be steeped in selflessness, but also in stoicism and politically detached public service, all of which she exemplified. Never partisan, her wise, generous, shrewd presence and leadership by example were at the heart of our parliamentary democracy and therefore of our politics, certainly throughout my life. Now, what a contrast with the sometimes shallow and utterly self-serving sloganeering, which can all too easily characterize some of our leaders. That the transition from one monarch to another could take place in an orderly and peaceful way, the passing on of the baton, tells us a great deal about her stewardship and about the ground rules for good governance, which she's bequeathed to her son. And all this in an age and time of uncertainty in a very disordered world. Democracies in an age of authoritarian regimes, of populism, ideologues, and dictators are fragile affairs. Buffeted in the headwinds of pandemic, war, consequential economic instability, and political extremism, our democracies are vulnerable to enemies, both old and new. It's salutary to observe how, in the face of such extraordinary monumental challenges, which sometimes even seem existential, a constitutional monarchy, a democracy, has provided continuity, cohesion, courage, stability, and strength. But beyond the institution, don't underestimate the significance of the Queen's servant leadership and the personal respect that it engendered even in the most die-hard Republicans. Queen Elizabeth's abiding belief in seeking the best was never seen more vividly than during her historic and reconciling visit to Ireland in 2011. It was a watershed. It was a bridge-building moment in British-Irish relations, which have been mired in so much bitterness, so much violence, and so much bad and tainted history. She insisted, these were her words, we must bow to the past. We must bow to the past, but not be bound by it. Given the assassination by Irish Republicans of Lord Mountbatten and the deaths of over 3,000 people during the Troubles, how much easier it would have been to brandish slogans like no surrender or Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right and so on. But a leader dedicated to finding solutions, or at the very minimum, better options, doesn't take refuge in the prison of history. That refusal to be bound by the past wasn't a new discovery. In that 1947 Cape Town speech, the young princess said that we could no longer simply see the world through the eyes of William Pitt. She insisted that we must embrace all people, her words, whatever race they come from, and whatever language they speak. Now, that wasn't unlike her belief in an evolving monarchy, and she said she had an unwavering faith, a high courage, and a quiet heart which would make the Commonwealth, quotes, which we all love so dearly, an even grander thing. Well, it was true then, in 1947, and it's true now. She could have quietly accepted the end of Britain's imperial past or encouraged us all to sing another verse of Rule Britannia, but instead of which she moved beyond the slogans and helped to lead a new endeavour, an extraordinary network of nations. The Commonwealth is about a third of the world's population, comprising 2.4 billion people living in some 56 countries. It's an amazing legacy. But whether at home or abroad, the watchword has been public service and duty, the vocation to which she knew she was called when she emphatically declared her words, "There is a motto which has been borne by many of my ancestors, a noble motto, I serve." I was struck when I signed a book of condolence in Liverpool that both our cathedrals were united as places of real mourning and prayer in what had been a sectarian city after all, but it had come to see that beyond the slogans of the tribe were things which united people across the denominational divide. In former times, religious leaders used their own variants of slogans to divide the community until courageous religious leaders like Bishop David Shepherd and Archbishop Derek Warlock said no, and that people with faith had a duty to stand together whenever they could. Queen Elizabeth unhesitatingly saw that leaders must embrace more than that which is familiar or comfortable and move beyond becoming mere cheerleaders for their supporters' club. In 1947, she called on God to help her to make good her vow, and during the decades in each of her Christmas Day broadcasts, and whether you believed or not was irrelevant, she would remind us of the centrality of her faith, but also her respect for people of other faiths and traditions and people of no faith. The central message was mutual respect and service for the common good. Someone else who understood the nature of leadership and moved way beyond his own community was the revered Rabbi Jonathan Lord Sachs, who was also incidentally a Roscoe lecturer. His books, The Home We Build Together and The Dignity of Difference, hold many clues about how to fashion a society built on respect and deeper values, certainly than those that can be encapsulated by slogans. 10 years after 9/11, he contrasted bin Laden's belief, and I quote, that the West is in decline, and Rabbi Sachs said, all great civilizations eventually decline, and when they begin to do so, they are vulnerable. Showing the attributes of a wise leader, Jonathan Sachs then seeks to identify some of the things which have made us so vulnerable and which in more recent times have emboldened other authoritarians, such as Putin and Xi Jinping, to believe that liberal democracy is too weak to move beyond navel-gazing and sloganeering. And Rabbi Sachs said this: the disintegration of the family, the demise of authority, the build-up of personal debt, the collapse of financial institutions, the downgrading of the American economy, the continuing failure of some European economies, the loss of a sense of honor, loyalty, and integrity, that's brought once esteemed groups into disrepute, the waning throughout the West of a sense of national identity. These are, he said, signs of arteriosclerosis of a culture, a civilization grown old. Whenever me takes precedence over we, he said, and pleasure today over viability tomorrow, a society is in trouble. So good leaders would ponder and reflect on those things and try to find ways forward, and they're not easy. A society which values itself must move beyond the slogans and the shallow debates about fringe issues and concerns which seem to dominate our headlines, and its leaders must be brave enough to insist that the renewal of our families, communities, ethical codes, standards in public life, might I say today, basic respect in public discourse, a commitment to renew the architecture, the scaffold, all of which are essential in a free society and crucial if we're going to see off the present serious challenges from our enemies. So in thinking about this talk, Stephen, and in the aftermath of the recent interminable shenanigans in Westminster, I wondered, well, are we capable of producing the kind of leaders to see us through which could well be an existential crisis? Certainly we've done so in the past. Think beyond political or religious allegiances and nation states to the significant men and women who have emerged from time to time. You'll choose your heroes and villains, from Napoleon to Bismarck, Gladstone to Disraeli, Luther to John Paul II, Reagan to Thatcher, Roosevelt to Churchill, and many, many more. But this, in 2022, we are at this moment in a state of virtual war. And I asked myself, what qualities make for a good leader then? And of course, along came Ukraine's president to provide me with an answer. Vladimir Zelensky has risen to the moment, much like Winston Churchill and other 20th century leaders did, when Vladimir Putin may well end up in the same league as Hitler and Stalin. The dangerous default position of those of us who are getting older is to nostalgically assert that today's political leaders are not up to scratch with those who preceded them. But in puzzling over the dearth of leadership in Europe and generally in the Western world, how easy it would be to sound like Statler and Waldorf, you know, those cantankerous characters who made their first balcony appearance in The Muppet Show in 1975. From the safety of the balcony, Statler and Waldorf delighted in jeering and heckling the entire cast of characters. What do you think of it so far? Not a lot. And then comes along a man like Zelensky to prove that circumstances can still produce great leaders, while the war crimes of Putin's army starkly remind us that the first duty of a nation's leader is to ensure the security and the defense of their people. Mr. Zelensky's extraordinary courage teaches us a great deal, sharply recalling much that has been forgotten. His example may even be capable of creating a renaissance in political leadership and move beyond sterile sloganeering and dispatch box jeering. Even at this late hour, what's occurred in Ukraine may force the weak and windy to consider whether they've fallen into the Byzantine trap of arguing amongst themselves as Constantinople and Byzantium were about to fall about the gender of angels. We get our priorities very badly muddled. The politics of peripheral concerns looks like self-indulgence of a high order when set alongside the scarred faces of civilians fleeing the carnage of their Ukrainian cities. The marginal and fringe obsessions, which have become occupations and the staple of political discourse and ideology, suddenly look largely irrelevant as the sovereign state continues its fight for survival. The English writer C.S. Lewis, in his book The Abolition of Man, concluded that inadequate education creates, his words, men without chests. It's a description that fits too many of us in leadership positions today. Are we, should we, be forming tomorrow's leaders, investing in young women and young men who need that kind of formation? Should we be giving them something other than politically correct wokeness, equipping them with a different kind of PC, political courage? Unhesitatingly, I would say yes. Character always shapes the nature of a leader, but it doesn't come from nowhere. And that's what good institutions will be doing. They'll be spotting the people that they should be cultivating and forming and helping them to find their way. Never neglect the interplay between character and leadership, where skills and judgment are honed in the university, I call it, of adversity, and from where leaders emerge because of the strength of character shaped often in adverse conditions, sometimes by circumstances, sometimes by years of apparent failure. Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister from 1957 to 1963, and who incidentally spent many years in the political wilderness, when asked what factors shape political careers, famously replied, "Events, dear boy, events." And since ancient times, our history books have described events that have made or broken leaders. The accounts are littered with examples of good and wise leaders and plenty of examples of their opposites. For every Cicero, there was a Caligula, the Roman emperor who in 4 short, capricious and inept years undermined the entire Roman Empire. For every Aristotle, there was a succession of Greek tyrants. In Europe, we call up the memory of towering figures like Bismarck and Gladstone, or from the 20th century, singular leaders like Churchill or Roosevelt, Konrad Adenauer, Charles de Gaulle, de Gasperi, John and Robert Kennedy, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, who, incidentally, Mr. Zelensky says inspired him. Adenauer, let's think about him for a moment. He'd been the mayor of Cologne, inspired by his own personal faith. He strongly opposed Nazism. They took away his job and his pension, and they left him destitute. He suffered enormously, but he never wavered. And his moment came at the age of 73, after the war, when he would become West Germany's leader and lead that country out of the abyss, out of the ashes of Auschwitz, out of the abyss into which he'd fallen. And what better example of a man mired in failure but waiting for the moment in which his leadership would save his nation than Winston Churchill, to whom I'll return. But we can hardly overlook the murderous ideologies in this context of contemporaries of theirs, such as Hitler and Stalin, and their contemporary imitators today in the fast-growing authoritarian states, from Belarus to Turkey, from North Korea, which I visited on 4 occasions, to Iran, and which modelled on the tyrannical leadership of Mr. Putin and Xi Jinping, threatened their own citizens, their own neighbours, and world order. Yes, we can summon the ghosts of America's founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and the rest, but we must also summon up the ghosts of the world's other superpower. In China, where between 1958 and 1962, in entrenching communism, historians estimate that Mao Zedong and his Chinese Communist Party were responsible for 45 million people losing their lives, making it the biggest mass murder ever recorded. By contrast, I often think of the bravery of the solitary tank man who stood in 1989 in an act of defiance in front of a column of CCP tanks in Tiananmen Square. That was sacrificial servant leadership of a very high order. In the book, The Oak and the Calf, reflecting on the sort of leaders who had condemned him to a Soviet Union communist gulag, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a one-man resistance movement against communism, asked, his words, "When our purpose in life is almost overwhelmed by the external circumstances of life, how do we cope? What sources of strength can we call on? Does character matter?" he asked. Well, as Mr. Zelensky has vividly demonstrated, character not only matters, it's at the very heart of what makes a good or bad leader, one who seeks solutions, whatever the circumstances, rather than simply sloganeering. In the UK, we've seen the importance of character in the spotty lives of parliamentary leaders who lose the trust of people because they themselves cannot be trusted to tell the truth or to live by the laws which they themselves have promoted. There's a joke being told by civil servants in Whitehall that in Ukraine, we have a leader who was once a comedian, but in the UK, it's the other way around. I've sometimes repeated a line from a Scouse comedian. The trouble, he said, with political jokes is that sometimes they get elected. It's a bit too close to the truth for my liking. But at least in a democracy, the electorate can tell jokes about their leaders and ultimately pass a verdict, turfing them out if they wish. The twisted character and lack of virtue in the lives of European, Asian, African, and Latin American dictators who have murdered, tortured, persecuted, plundered, or imprisoned their citizens succinctly answers Solzhenitsyn's question: character does matter. It's notable, and again we see it in Zelensky, but the character of great leaders has often been formed in adversity or suffering. He's the grandson of a man whose 3 Jewish brothers were all murdered or executed by the Nazis. Driven by a patriotic belief in the common good, such leaders invariably have a vision based on upholding the rule of law, entrenching democratic rights, the creation of societies based on fairness, merit, justice, and truth. Men like Zelensky see leadership as public service, not as a passport for corrupt self-enrichment, and they've been made in that furnace of suffering. In 1979, on entering the House of Commons as the baby of the House, I was privileged to encounter political leaders who had been formed during the vicissitudes of World War II. For many, it was their last parliament. For me, it was my first. Many had direct family memories of the colossal loss of life during World War I. Those harrowing experiences, which we will be recalling in this week of remembrance, tempered their attitudes and their thinking. War had made leaders of men who might otherwise have been footnotes in our history books. Churchill, I said I would return, and with whom Zelensky is sometimes compared, had a very checkered political career spanning 70 years. I might add that the first time I ever went to Westminster was as a boy at school, when we were taken there in, I think, 1965, to walk past the coffin of Winston Churchill that had been laid in state. And the most recent time that I walked through that hall at the laying in state, of course, was at the laying in state of Her Majesty the Queen. Disastrous decision in 1915 Churchill's decision to invade Turkey at Gallipoli, his advocacy of the use of poison gas, his treatment of strikers, support for eugenics and much more besides, are not on the face of it the marks of a great leader, but the ability to learn from mistakes is. It was a mentor of mine in Liverpool who gave me a lot of my first experiences in street politics, who said to me, David, the man who never made a mistake never made anything. It's what you do about it that matters. In Churchill's case, a much greater man learned from his failures and the years in that political wilderness. That greater self-awareness and deepening of his character and continuation in public service despite rejections and wilderness years, and often even being humiliated, it was reflected in his determination not to give up and this willingness to stand alone, having correctly read the threat posed by the rise of Hitler. It made him the leader that a country at war desperately then needed. And his inspiring words and courage were the gifts his country needed. Yet in 1945, very interestingly, of course, they didn't re-elect him, preferring instead the vision of a more just society presented to them by Clement Attlee. But Churchill then demonstrated, I think, the greatest leadership gift of all in accepting defeat and ensuring the peaceful democratic transfer of power to his opponents. He didn't lead or incite angry mobs to storm Parliament Square, and he would have been aghast to see the kinds of scenes that were seen on Capitol Hill in 2021 in his beloved America. I once spent some time with Václav Havel, who described how during the terrible communist years in Czechoslovakia, how it felt as if everyone had been compromised by the nature of the regime. The character had been subverted. He said that personal survivor had become their foremost consideration. He said that the population was living a lie in which truth had become the first casualty. But the saving message, he said, is that the truth prevails for those who live in truth. And he added that in the formation of the next generation of leaders, this message might be described, his words, as inscribed on the Moses basket of every nation's babies. Well, that message was certainly inscribed on Mr. Zelensky's Moses basket and imbibed with his mother's milk and also the milk of so many of the millions of Ukrainians who have been fighting with such courage and bravery to retain the sovereignty of their nation. Like Mr. Havel, President Zelensky understood the nature of the corrupted and dictatorial system that the Kremlin seeks to reimpose on Ukraine and its people, or that Hitler sought to impose upon us. He knows his own story and that of his own people. And like so many before him in Central and Eastern Europe, he's unfurled his banner of truth and risked his life in its defense. He's got the stomach to fight for his freedom. He also knows the price tag attached to freedom. On becoming president, he wore wristbands bearing the names of soldiers killed in the eastern Donbass region, where 14,000 people have been killed after Russia's invasion, not last February, but in 2014. A good leader is never careless with the lives of their citizens, and Mr. Zelensky knows the nature of human loss. A good leader inspires and leads by example. So he turned down the option of being airlifted out of Kiev, being taken to safety in the US, saying, I need ammunition, not a ride. He knew that a good leader inspires by example, not by hiring a marketing company or offering a slogan, but knowing that blood, sweat, and tears, as Churchill would have said, were the things that he would have to sacrifice at the time of need in his own country. There's something very appropriate about the title of the TV series he starred in from 2015, in which he played the part of a modest history teacher who described corruption and came to power. The series was entitled Servant of the People. Now, I visited Ukraine before the end of Soviet rule, and we need to learn from Ukraine's belief in our values and our post-war freedoms, which we are too lazy about sometimes and too indifferent about their defense. But those of the freedoms which created the conditions which led Putin to believe that he could place a new Iron Curtain across the heart of Europe. He didn't think we cared enough to fight for them. In the West, we should make, therefore, a careful study of the circumstances which have produced such bravery, not least because what Putin has done to Ukraine could be the fate of millions of other people. As Putin has demonstrated, leadership without adequate restraint is dangerous. Strong leaders, rather than character, can so easily morph into authoritarian leaders, even dictators, or even believing themselves to be immortal gods. In North Korea, notable for voting with Mr. Putin at the United Nations in favor of the war in Ukraine, a succession of Kims have described themselves as supreme leader. Kim Il-sung went one further and took the title eternal leader. Well, having seen the preserved earthly remains of Supreme Leader Kim Jong-il, along with those of Lenin and Mao in their Kremlin and Tiananmen Square mausoleums, I can attest that the epithet eternal was perhaps premature. Kim Jong-un has settled for Supreme Leader. Not that any visitor to that united country can see any evidence of great leadership, just gross suffering of impoverished people, while its leaders live in luxury and squander vast sums of money on developing nuclear weapons. Too easily intoxicated on their own propaganda, such leaders need the whispering voice of the Roman slave who accompanied victorious generals as they paraded triumphantly throughout the streets of Rome to the temple of Jupiter, constantly reminding them, you are not mortal, you are mortal. You're not immortal, you are mortal. Like their Roman ancestors, leaders and would-be leaders can all too easily fall victim to narcissistic egotism and vanity and believe that they will go on forever. Of such leaders, Statler or Waldorf would doubtless say, what do you think of them? Not a lot. But faced with Ukraine's president, we have the antidote to the dearth of leadership in too many democracies. Let me end, though, by returning to the British Parliament. Slogans can propel you into political life, even to high office. Too often, this is the result of wanting to be things rather than to do things. I want to mention the man I believe to have been the greatest British Member of Parliament. He never became a government minister and never became the leader of a party, let alone Prime Minister. He had little ambition to be things. It's hard to identify him with left or right, but easy to identify him with character and right or wrong. Hard to fit him into a pigeonhole, but easy to identify him with a cause and also with a great evil to which he wanted to find a solution. In 1787, a group of British thinkers opposed the transatlantic slave trade, and they set in place what would later be described as the first contemporary human rights campaign. They met in a printing shop and bookstore at 2 Great George's Yard in the City of London and began what I call the first human rights campaign in our history. The cause was deeply unpopular. It was the abomination of the slave trade. Quaker women organized a meeting, and Thomas Clarkson, a Cambridge University student who after a religious experience had abandoned his studies and vowed to give his life to organizing opposition to the slave trade, was given the task of finding a parliamentary leader for the campaign. And they recruited William Wilberforce, the Member of Parliament for Hull. And in 1807, it would be William Roscoe, who was briefly in the House of Commons, who would join forces with him in opposing the transatlantic slave trade. The French political philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville said that what happened that day in 2 George's Yard was, quote, absolutely without precedent. If you pore over the histories of all peoples, I doubt that you'll find anything more extraordinary, he said. Tocqueville was not simply referring to the desire for freedom or the enactment of just laws. What he detected was the organization of a systematic, civic, democratic campaign with the aim of defending the fundamental rights of other human beings, a group of like-minded and highly motivated people, and they set out to change the world, and they did just that. The abolitionists may not have had the internet or social media, but it was no coincidence that in 1787, their meeting was held in that printing shop where the Quakers published their tracts, and a flurry of anti-slavery books, posters, pamphlets, and prints accompanied by huge public meetings across the towns and cities of England, challenged people to change their hearts and minds, and then they changed the laws. Almost 6 million people were taken into slavery between 1701 and 1810, with 1 in 4 ships leaving Liverpool alone being a slaver, and the profits amounted in Liverpool in 1807 to a staggering £17 million sterling. The vested interests pitted themselves, of course, against reform. But the great leaders of the day rose to the occasion and they stood against this massive injustice. It was real servant leadership. It wasn't self-regarding virtue. It was a moral goodness in the pursuit of the common good that led them to take that stand. It wasn't through demagogy or the excoriation of opponents, but through all tirades of abuse or simplistic and sometimes deceitful scaremongering. It was to take a principle and stand on a principle and convince people that the arguments were right. We must do the same in cultivating leadership in our own times. But let me end then with, as I did at the beginning of my remarks, but with the words of Queen Elizabeth at the outset of the COVID pandemic. She pointed the British people to the future and to how we should behave. She said, I hope in the years to come, everyone will be able to take pride in how they respond to this challenge. And those who come after us will say the Britons of this generation were as strong as any, but the attributes of self-discipline, of quiet, good-humoured resolve, and of fellow feeling still characterize this country. The pride in who we are is not a part of our past. It defines our present and our future. So, Steve, these characteristics, these attributes which she hoped might identify the British people, good humour, resolve, self-discipline and fellow feeling, they're most certainly qualities that can be ascribed to this much loved and remarkable woman who promised as a 21-year-old that she would serve her country throughout all her days, and who unfailingly kept her word in doing so. But they are also the marks of servant leadership. And in our own rather more modest ways, they should inspire each of us to play our part in finding solutions to the complex, sometimes daunting and often dangerous challenges with which we are confronted. Thank you for listening.